So, hello and welcome everyone. I am Jan Sveinar. I am a director of the Center on Global Economic Governance here at SIPA, and I'm the Richard and Gardner Professor of Economics and International Affairs. It's a real pleasure today to introduce to you two of my best friends, colleagues, co-authors over the decades, namely Simon Commander, who is here, and Saul Estrin, who is joining us online and will participate during the question and answers that we'll have after the presentation. So the presentation is about a book that was published by Cambridge University Press, just fresh off the press, called The Connections World, The Future of Asian Capitalism. And the program is co-sponsored by us and the Columbia, Harvard, China, and the World Program, CWP, the Columbia University Weatherhead, East Asian Institute, the APEC Study Center, and the Center and the Greater China Initiative. So thank you all for co-sponsoring this. Let me just give you a brief introduction for our speakers. Simon Commander, here on my left, is managing partner of Altura Partners, which is a firm that provides advice to governments and companies in emerging economies. He's also visiting professor of economics at the EA Business School in Madrid. From 1998 to 2011, he worked at the European Bank for Reconstruction of Development in London. I had a pleasure to work with him one summer on an annual report that the bank was putting out. And from 1988 until 1998, he was at the World Bank in Washington, DC. Saul Estrin is professor at the London School of Economics. He was the founding head of the Department of Management at the London School of Economics. He created that entire unit, and was formerly also professor of economics and associate dean at the London Business School. He does research in a variety of areas in international business and entrepreneurship. He puts emphasis on emerging economies. He has many special prizes, etc. to him. Let me just mention he's former president of the European Association for Comparative Economic Systems. It was a pleasure to serve on the board when he was president there, and he is fellow of the Academy of International Business. So, Simon, the floor is yours. Deliver the presentation, and then we'll have a discussion. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Jan. It's really very nice to be here. I haven't been here for over 10 years, I think, to one of your conferences when Saul and I were both here. And I'm going to try and keep it as short as I can, basically to about half an hour, and then we could have some discussion and you can say what you think about it. So as Jan mentioned, this is the book. It's called The Connections World, The Future of Asian Capitalism, that Saul and I wrote. And that's for you, Jan.
Oh, thank you.
And it just came out in the States for whatever reason, different timetable from Europe and the UK. So it just came out in February. And our book really is an attempt to sort of, it's not small thinking, shall we say, and maybe we're guilty of perhaps thinking too boldly. That'll be for you to judge. But it's really an attempt to ask a couple of fairly leading questions about a bit of the world that I need hardly tell you is extremely important. After all, Asia accounts for, what is it, 60% of the world's population, about 45% of world GDP as measured in PPP terms or something like that, and so on and so on. So Asia really matters. So our book is a bit about the past. It tries to understand why Asia, more than anywhere else, has been the great success of the last half century. It looks at the reasons for that and asks whether Asia is going to be the great success going forward. Because after all, there's a lot of stuff written, some of it good, some of it fairly journalistic, saying the 21st century is going to be Asia's and all of that. So we look at that in hopefully a more scientific way. And we basically argue that some of the strengths that Asia's had that have driven it forward over these last 50 years, in more senses than not, whether it's in income, whether it's broader indices of development, we basically argue that some of those strengths are likely to form into fallibilities unless they're addressed in policy and other terms. And I'll come to that in a second. Now, particularly among economists, and Jan and everyone will know, and Arvind here, there's always been a big debate. Part of it has been normative, part of it has been positive. Do economies succeed by following the market, or do they succeed because the state does clever and innovative things? And in the context of Asia, essentially in the book, we argue that this contrast between state and market, in a sense, misses the mark. And what really is happening in Asia is that the growth and everything else has been achieved with different policies and different configurations than those that have been pursued in other originally less developed countries that have become richer in due course. And in particular, what we argue is that the combination of public policy, which includes, by the way, industrial policy defined as policy directed towards helping particular sectors or activities grow, often through financial and other assistance, combinations of public policy and a reliance on business groups has been the hallmark that has cut across Asia. And when I say Asia, I should clarify that in the book, we're really talking about what is coarsely referred to as middle-income Asia. So we're not really talking about Nepal or Laos or Cambodia. We're talking about middle-income Asia. And what we find is that whether it's Vietnam, China, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, there are actually some remarkably similar features, some common features, and ultimately some common fallibilities. And these come out of these reliance on these particular configurations. But one feature that we stress in particular is that the use of public policy and reliance on business groups has led to surprisingly coordinated outcomes. And therefore, the terrain that exists at present, which is marked by, as I shall show, a large amount of market concentration, market power vested in the hands of major business groups, is, in a sense, a product of that coordination for good or for bad. I'll come to that. Now, the common feature that we identify in the book and make a big part of our story are these pervasive and what we call pervasive and persistent networks of connections that run between politicians, political parties, and businesses, notably the business groups. And these ties facilitate all sorts of access, contracts, and returns. And this is what we call, in the title of the book, the connections world. And the connections world is being, as we argue, a great supporter of Asia's growth till now, but that's much less clear in the future. Now, what is the connections world made up of? At its apex basically sits political parties and individual politicians, and the other big component are businesses. Some of them are state-owned enterprises. They're a declining share of these economies and a declining number of them as well. Some have more than others, like China, but in general, that's a declining part. And the interactions between these two apex sitting groups are highly transactional, really highly transactional. So politicians look for campaign contributions, they look for jobs, maybe for themselves when they lose power, their family. That's normally a small part of it. They look for licenses and permits, because after all, in most of these economies, not just in sectors that are extractive, like mining and the like, but in many areas, you need permits to get on. And those permits come from public authority. And firms look for protection from foreign and domestic competition, subsidies, loans, contracts, and so on. And there tends to also be some reciprocity at work. I don't have enough time to go into that, although it's quite interesting. And this sort of, in a sense, this flow chart gives an indication of precisely those dimensions and interactions that I've just described. Now, the networks that link them up we argue in the book, are way beyond simple cronyism. It's not just a question of me knowing Jan and giving him a contract or whatever. I mean, and there've been plenty of books, including some excellent books, Lin Pei's book on China's crony capitalism, for example. But I'm not sure that cronyism is the right optic, the right lens through which to observe this, because this is really altogether much more systematic. And what we argue is that these webs of connections come together with very common purpose, with common modes of procedure of working, and these cut across political systems, although obviously they are influenced. And the shape of these networks is undoubtedly formed in and around political and institutional arrangements in the country, but that's not the only aspect that one should focus on. Let's have a look at some of the network maps we have. Now, this comes from a large data set that we use, which is essentially about connections between politicians, parties, individuals, and companies, whether state or privately owned. And here we have two very different institutional arrangements. So on the left, no surprise there, we have China, sort of Cyclops Eye, party in the center, a whole bunch of politicians around it, a whole lot of SOEs, state-owned enterprises, and private firms and individuals, the sort of black dots. And over there in India, two major parties. This, by the way, is 2018, so one party would be larger if we did it now, probably. But basically the BJP and the Congress Party, and then a whole bunch of regional parties. So the institutional arrangement clearly have a major impact on how these networks are structured. And in the book, we basically have these maps for all the countries that we cover. There's a lot of detail there, and sadly, I don't think I'm going to be able to cover it in the presentation, but I'm happy to come back to it. But now, in this, by the way, let me just say, to clarify, here, essentially, every observation, a party or an individual or company is a node, and there's no difference in size. The difference in size is merely a function of the number of links or ties that run off those nodes. So in other words, hence this and that. So just to clarify that. So it's a slightly naive diagram, but I think it's an extremely interesting and illustrative one. Now, in these arrangements, conditioned, as you can see, by local some local specificities, one of the important elements in that are these private businesses. And it's notable both in China and in India. It's not just a world populated by SOEs anymore. There are lots of private businesses, big businesses. And most of these are actually, at least certainly in this data set and in the economy as a whole, as I'll come to, are composed of business groups. Now, what are business groups? Are they just simply conglomerates in the sense that we talk about them in, say, this country or in the UK or in Europe? Well, no. Business groups, as we define it, are mostly familial, often dynastic, several generations. They're generally very diversified, and they're highly persistent. They don't go away once they come into existence. They tend to hang around. And in that, and I'm going to cut across a lot of territory, their pyramidal ownership structures allow their owners levels of control often far in excess of their actual levels of ownership. And it basically gives them an enormous amount of discretion in decision-making, in asset allocation that is both good, can be for the good and for the bad. Minority shareholders are consistently disadvantaged. Tunneling is quite easy to do in these sorts of arrangements. As I mentioned, owners can shift resources around, often at will. And they are extremely good at deterring predators, whether it be other businesses that want to acquire them or politicians who might want to take control of them or nationalize them or whatever. Now, in this, the question comes obviously back to why is Asia got these business groups? Is it simply about sociology? differences in the weight of families and the like? Is this just about Asia being, in a sense, 50 years behind, in inverted commas, the US or the UK in organizational terms? Well, I don't think we really think that. Now, one of the reasons for why business groups might exist has been well trod in the literature, and that's because they might help address missing or incomplete markets for capital, finance, and indeed for management. So many of the business groups, probably the best example is India's Tata Sons, set up management cadres very early on, very effectively. So you could argue that they do that. But in the book, we argue that although that is a part of the story, it's by no means the whole part, and maybe not even the major part. Business groups, we argue, are ideally suited for the connections world. They provide concentrated points of contact. After all, if you're the prime minister or president and you just want to influence aspects of the economy, in the Philippines, you might just get on the phone to about 6 family heads. They facilitate reciprocity gains with politicians and the like. And as I pointed out in the argument about coordination, they can provide really quite effective vehicles for national or developmental goals. Now, insofar as that's the case, it's important to note that business groups, once entrenched, rarely go away. So just take the example of Indonesia, for instance. Not most, but a very significant part of Indonesia's major business groups right now essentially date back to the Suharto era. And despite the fall in that regime, virtually no expropriations occurred. I mean, one of the groups, Salim, lost one of its big assets, but is still actually a major player. So once you're in, you tend to be in. It's very rare that you disappear. Sometimes you underperform relative to your peers because there is competition amongst business groups, but you rarely drop off the scene. The second thing is these business groups are remarkably good at accreting both business power and wealth. And the most stark example, of course, is Samsung. Samsung accounts for about 22% of South Korea's GDP. Remember, in per capita terms, South Korea is significantly richer than Spain, say, so that's not a trivial sum. And the son of Samsung's founder, who died a couple of years ago, his estate was north of about 21 billion. Similarly, there's an example there from Thailand. So these business groups are both powerful politically and in terms of wealth. And that gives rise, as I'll come to a bit later, to a great deal of inequality in wealth. Now, clearly an example, I'm just putting this up because it's, as it were, very contemporaneous, the Adani Group. So as we know, a short seller based in this city essentially published a research note about 6 weeks back alleging very bad governance and a lot of excessive debt accumulation in the company, and that has led to about a 60% decline in the Adani Group's market cap for its publicly listed components, which, by the way, are not necessarily the largest bit of the group. Having said that, Adani is a magnificent example of how a business group can accrete businesses, activities, wealth, and influence, and in a very short period of time. So the market capitalization of the group rose by in excess of 4,000% in the space of a decade. Pretty remarkable. It's composed of many interests: energy, infrastructure, petrochemicals, mining, and the most recent thing being the acquisition of the last major independent media company in India. Most of its sectors are those that require government permits, contracts, or other licenses. And there's plenty of evidence way before Hindenburg published its report that Adani basically used its own internal capital market and a great proliferation of related party transactions to raise resources. And the last point that I make is that essentially standing back from it, you could say that that extraordinary rise in its market cap has to be related to what investors consider to be its political ties to the current government and to the current Prime Minister. Okay, now if the connections world, which I've just described, has been an important element in driving Asia's growth, which we argue, and has led to some very substantial, significant groups of companies occupying large bits of the economic territory of these economies, then we also argue that looking forward, most of the book is looking forward, that it exposes a set of fallibilities that really ought to be addressed. Firstly, the attenuation of competition, which I'll just come to. Secondly, which is extremely important, originally I was a labor economist, so this goes very much to the heart of my interest, it limits the amount of so-called good or productive job creation and sustains informality. That's, by the way, been a goal of just about every government from Nehru onwards, who've argued that reducing informality, raising employment, should be a central function of every government. Well, to cut to the quick, in most Asian economies, those goals have been signal failures, really. It holds back the shift to an economy based on innovation and has other not so desirable attributes. So let's go to competition. Now, the main issue here is not that these groups don't compete with each other. They often do, and sometimes viciously. But essentially, by occupying significant parts of sectors, activities, and the like, they in effect, often in collusion with politicians, don't allow competitors to enter. And entry barriers for new firms are consequently high. They can be high through regulatory and other costs and other discretionary measures as well. In addition, exit by poorly performing or inefficient affiliates of business groups tends to be quite limited. It's often that these inefficiencies are sustained by intra-group financial transfers, and ultimately competition in the economy as a whole is restrained. Now, when you want to look at market power, obviously, you generally want to look at concentration, you want to look at profits, and you want to look at prices. Now, the last two are very difficult to do in any of these economies, not least of all because these business groups have quite opaque accounting in more cases than not. So just let's look for the sake of argument, more than the sake of argument, at concentration ratios. That's the total revenues of the top 5 and top 10 listed and unlisted companies in these various economies in 2018 relative to GDP. And the benchmark is the US. So the US is at 3 and 4, 3% for the top 5, 4% for the top 10. I know in the US, you normally think about particular markets, Google's share and search and the like. You look at a more disaggregated level, but at an aggregate level, these are quite small amounts of concentration. Now, in Vietnam, put it this way, a staggering 30 to 40%, well, yeah, 30 to 40% of GDP is accounted for by either the top 5 or the top 10 groups. And that is also true, very large amounts, in South Korea, Thailand, and the Philippines. And even in the two very large economies, China and India, it's between 10 and 15%. And some more recent data that we're doing in conjunction with an Indian academic, Naveen Thomas, suggests that we probably underestimate for India. The share in recent times is actually even higher. So there's lots of concentration that comes out of this system. In terms of employment, it's not that business groups don't post jobs. They do. They post very good jobs often. They're quite productive and they pay well. But the number of people who can get those jobs is very small. And labor productivity as a whole in these economies still averages between 10 and 15%, quite small relative to, say, the OECD. And what that means is not just that there are not many good jobs that are being posted, but that the firm size structure is also rather distorted. And what we find across these economies is that there is really a missing middle of firms, along with a relatively small number of large firms, mostly business group or state-owned enterprises, and a massive amount of small but largely informal companies with very little capital and very little employment. And few firms rise through the ranks. In other words, you don't get nice progressions across that. Now, if that's the framework, in the book we argue, and I'm conscious that I want to give about 5 minutes more to this and then move to discussion. We argue that all of this hasn't been bad for growth, quite self-evidently. I mean, Asia's been the great growth story. And now, so where's that growth come from? I think by and large, most economists would consider that growth has been driven extensively, i.e. by the applications of more capital and more labor, and it's been less a case of productivity growth. Now, we already see, notably in China, where the demographics have turned, that the ability to rely on extensive growth is being qualified, or if not, nullified. And so looking forward, most of these economies will have to start looking to innovation, i.e. to productivity increases, to drive growth. Now, where do business groups and their networks of relationships stand in all of this? Well, the answer is not clear-cut. It's actually quite ambiguous. You can imagine, looking at economic models, that with monopolistic competition, leading-edge companies will seek to escape competition by innovating. So Philippe Aghion and others have modeled that very nicely. So you could well imagine, perhaps, that some good would come from having a framework in that nature. Maybe even the ability to attract resources from government, whether it be directed lending or subsidies, could also stimulate innovation if it were directed in an efficient way, which is, of course, a big caveat. But having said that, pyramidal structures that allow their owners to shift resources around, again, is ambiguous. You could imagine if you had an enlightened, far-seeing owner, as it were, a dynast, that may well be good news for innovation. But you could also imagine that if they're thinking about preserving other bits of their empire or using it for acquiring new assets or other sorts of priorities, then that might not be consistent with innovation. Finally, market power, political connections can simply promote rent seeking. And there's examples from that. And in point of fact, in the book, we point out that some of the less well-performing economies in Asia, such as the Philippines and Pakistan, probably conform much more to that, where they have a much higher intensity of connections. And that higher intensity of connections in turn translates into less competition and more rent seeking. And finally, limits to entry and exit, the churning that we know to be a feature of most dynamic economies, it tends to be absent and therefore hinders innovation. Now, in some parallel work, some papers that we're putting out in the lab, we essentially look at this and ask, from the data that's available, do business groups innovate more or less? And the argument, by and large, is that business group affiliates tend to innovate more than non-affiliates, and that's due to non-market advantages. What we also find, however, is that business groups tend to hold back innovation on aggregate, basically because they crowd out non-affiliated firms, perhaps by limiting access to external funding or reducing the returns to innovation, and they suppress, ultimately, entry and exit, which I've just mentioned. Now, perhaps a part of the puzzle is solved when one looks at whether actually Asia is innovating or not, is an innovative place. And I'll come to this because there's some qualifications on. Here, essentially, we do a very simple exercise. We relate GDP per capita, in other words, a control for the size of the economy, to R&D spending. And what you can see is that there's one extraordinary outlier, South Korea, which is right above the line and the confidence interval, and the rest basically either sit on or slightly above the line. In another slide, which I won't put up just now, we will relate essentially the amount of spending on R&D to the outputs. So that's the inputs, the outputs being high quality patents. What do we mean by high quality patents? We mean patents lodged in more than one jurisdiction and involving a foreign jurisdiction. So in other words, it's got to be worth their while to try and invest in all of that. And what we find again is that, with the exception of South Korea and to some extent China, none of the Asian economies lie very far off where they would be expected to be for their level of incomes. Okay, let me conclude now. We argue that Asia's need looking forward is to raise productivity, to increase innovation, but to do that, it will have to deal with the power of the connections world. But that world isn't going to go away anytime soon. In fact, none of the players, whether the politicians, the political parties, or the businesses themselves, have any logic in undermining the system as yet. And it will therefore require the adoption of explicit policies to try and deal with that. Now, whether these are likely to be adopted is another matter, and I'll come to that in conclusion. Now, in a very, very summary and unsatisfactory way, I'm going to put up the 5 or broad areas. Changes to corporate governance. I mean, the Indians have actually, in changes to the company law, tried to deal with some of this, its role, protection for minority shareholders and the like. There are a whole bunch of things there. Second, prohibitions on pyramids, subsidiaries, related party transactions and the like. Now, this is a model that's probably got potentially some mileage in it. This is precisely what Roosevelt did in the 1930s, when in the aftermath of the Great Depression, and in a sense, the public discontent with large business groups in the US, he essentially passed a whole bunch of measures that in effect outlawed them, prescribed them. That was also, by the way, done in Japan, and successfully by MacArthur, drawing indeed on the Roosevelt model. And despite the fact that from 1997 onwards, business groups are, the law outlawing business groups has been repealed, actually they haven't made a recrudescence and do not have the same types of concentration that we see elsewhere. The third area, which is particularly susceptible, is the imposition of additional tax liabilities. For example, using additional taxes for established business groups to try and steer them towards adopting different corporate formats, tax and dividends. And perhaps most promisingly of all, again, taken from the Japan model, the adoption of inheritance taxes. South Korea has recently adopted a 50% inheritance tax. It's 55% in Japan, but for instance, in India and elsewhere, there's no inheritance tax. So it's quite interesting that the current head of Samsung has indicated that he will be the last family member to run that combinat. We shall see, but it's quite interesting because South Korea went through a whole phase of imposing prohibitions on cross-holdings and the like, all of which were fundamentally avoided by the groups. The inheritance tax may actually have more bite. Competition policy, here I think we have some quite interesting example from Israel in the last decade. Maybe condition policy on market structure and move to limit market shares, particularly for business groups, looking not just at concentration in particular sectors, which is the standard tool in trade for competition policy people, but maybe looking at concentration in the economy as a whole. And finally, probably the thing that is the most wishful of the thinking, looking at greater transparency. Actually, asset and interest declarations for politicians, including proper penalties, are almost entirely absent right through the region. I believe in Pakistan, we cite it in the book, I can't remember it exactly, politicians were asked or even meant to give declarations of their assets and income, and I believe none of them ever did so. So on that note, I think I'll end, but just to say that we've tried in the book to understand and acknowledge the extraordinary success of Asia, because there's nothing else that you could say about it, and in a constructive way try and think about how that success could be carried forward in the future. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. This was both informative and provocative. So we'll turn to questions. Maybe I'll start as prerogative of the chair to maybe start this and prepare your questions, comments. So I think this is, really interesting. It occurred to me as you were discussing it, to what extent there are similarities and differences with other parts of the world. So in Latin America, you also have a lot of family firms, right? In fact, the corporation is an American, it's a US phenomenon. In large parts of the world, it's family firms that are dominant. Even in Germany, the Mittelstand, the sort of large part of the German economy, the medium-sized firms, which are quite large, medium-sized can be quite large, are really dynastic family firms. And yet in some of these economies like Germany, we have different outcomes, right? So kind of what is driving it, to what extent it's, for instance, other things like as you described, the competition, is tough, but it's kind of oligopolistic in the sense that they know about each other. There are a few of them and they know about each other. That's why it's such a tough competition, because you know who your opponent is. If it's perfectly competitive system where you have thousands of producers, you don't even know who they are, right? Here you really know who they are. So that's sort of interesting there. And, what's always bothered me about this is, why do in these pyramidal structures minority shareholders stay there? Because as you say, they get taken to the cleaners, and yet somehow for it to work, they have to be the people from whom you steal, from whom you take, the minority shareholders, right? And in terms of the policy options, I think you're right on target. And the question is whether they can be implemented. And you've given examples, Israel and other countries, where they implemented a variety of them. So, which countries in Asia can we expect will be most likely to implement them sufficiently that they'll move into the next phase of innovation and so on and so forth. So let me open it up. Yes, please.
Hi, Simon. Hello. Welcome. Nice. Yeah.
Thank you. No, one of the questions, of course, is you're lumping a huge, vast region together. And in particular, what would like to know the distinction is between the original East Asian miracle countries, the Gang of Four and so on, and the rest, and some of the Southeast Asian. What are the different categories in which one can distinguish it? You would disaggregate Asia a little bit. And are there any significant differences between different groups of Asian countries? Thank you.
Let me welcome Saul Estrin, whom we see on the screen right now. Hi, Saul.
We can't hear
You're
you.
muted. You're muted. Yeah.
I'm unmuted now. Shall I have a go at answering some of those?
Yes. Why don't we collect a few and then exactly we'll bring you in. Yes. Any other questions on the first round here? Okay.
Hi, I guess two questions. One is, it seems that most of the discussion have left Japan out of place. And I did mention Japan at the very end. It seems to me the impression is that somehow Japan has kind of like jumped out, managed to deal with the connecting world scenario. And I'm wondering, was that the conclusion in the book, or like why Japan is not discussed as frequently as South Korea and China in this kind of presentation? And the second question is, I think your analysis of Asia being this like connecting world is really well argued. And I do wonder whether this particular Asian case, Asian uniqueness, or the same problem of being kind of like having huge monopolies and like corporates in the government, like with connection to government, has been like, we see similar situation in US as well.
Yeah. Is
that like a global trend, or like do you see something that's like very unique to Asia to deserve to be its own case?
The other, okay, there is one over there, and then Arvind. Yeah.
Maybe it's related to the first question. Asia is you define such a big region, and within that region, you have some real successes like Korea with Samsung, and it's hard for me to put that in the same category as Pakistan. And if you look at a lot of other countries like Greece and Turkey, they probably also have these business groups. And some of them are successful, some of them are not. So maybe the common denominator of success is not that structure, but something else within some of those Asian countries like China and Korea that are, or others that are very successful.
Mm-hmm.
So
here, Arvind, Korea, right here.
So, business groups are the outcomes. They exist. And the way the discussion you sort of presented, you don't mention anything about the policies. And if I look historically, business groups in India existed before 1990. They exist today, but it's a very different world. China, the world prior to 1980, very different. Post 1980, very different. At the end of the day, it seems to me, in the end, you can't tell this story of, and then of course, you heard the 4 Asian tigers. Those stories you really can't tell without the policies. Business groups are undoubtedly, as outcomes, part of that story. But they are probably not the driving part of the story. Did growth happen because the business groups existed? I seriously doubt that. I think policy was very dominant, had a very dominant role in the whole thing.
Okay, one more over there, and then we'll take a round of answers, and we can take another round of questions.
This kind of business groups has like clear benefits in their local markets, like with the connections and this kind of things. But these business groups are like Samsung and others, like also compete in the international market by going somewhere, expanding. And how do you think these business groups like compete with each other in the international group? Do they collude, or do they compete more forcefully? And how do you think that happens in this international market?
So Saul and Simon, why don't you divide it however you want? Okay, Saul, go ahead.
Shall I go first?
Yeah.
Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I really very interesting and important questions that have been raised, and I'm going to pick some of the easier ones and leave everything difficult to Simon. I think, just to be clear about our argument here, we're trying to look at 2 sides of a problem, not one side of a problem. Or maybe the word isn't right, problem is not right. We're looking at a situation where a particular set of organizational arrangements and policies and et cetera, put together, generated very rapid growth for reasons that we believe we understand, which I'm about to explain in a moment, and which we now think the economic problems are, so to speak, outgrowing those structures, but those structures are essentially entrenched. And so that's the core of the fragility. We are in an effective political economy equilibrium in which governments benefit from their relationship with business groups benefit from their relationships with governments. That continues to happen, but nonetheless in key areas, for examples like innovation, which are needed as you make the shift from extensive to intensive growth, this is not really the best structure. Now, we argue, and this is essentially because of the high levels of market power. Now, to the person who made a very powerful point about the role of policy, that is exactly our view, right? The thing that makes Asia specifically different from other parts of the world is the combination of, for the most part, a desire to grow and develop, often but not always through a very active industrial policy, and an organizational structure in which there is a very significant, what you might call, over-internalization. You have internalization at the level of a market, and you have internalization across markets. Now, that internalization gives you huge benefits of coordination. The government, essentially, you've got something almost analogous to a Soviet-type planning system, except the firms are private, and they operate across multiple markets and often have their own internal capital market too. That's the essence of the business group. So this begins to address the point Jan is making about it's not that they're family-owned firms that is in any way relevant to us, right? What is relevant is that they are firms that are very highly diversified across labor markets, capital markets, and a series of product markets, and very highly concentrated, so that if a government wishes to run a coherent active industrial policy, it can do so on the basis of dealing with half a dozen or a dozen dynastic leaders, oligarchs, rather than with the whole economy. And that's essentially the commonality. And we do believe that this is surprisingly common. Some of the data Simon showed you is surprisingly common across Asia. On Japan, just this is a very small, I won't spend long on this. We basically are looking, our issue is how suitable is this framework for the next stage of development in Asia? Japan has passed that threshold and via MacArthur and so forth has dealt with most of these institutional issues at the end of the Second World War. And so it's essentially in a different category, and that's why we choose to exclude it. Simon?
Right. That's really nice. Well, actually, there's so many interesting questions there. I mean, starting with Jan, you're right. The sort of business group format is by no means just an Asian phenomenon. I mean, they've been present for a long time in Latin America, although they've dwindled over time, actually, and dwindled very significantly. Essentially, they were major parts of the Brazilian, Argentine economies and the like, and they had many of the features. They weren't quite as diversified, it must be said. But I mean, talking to friends who know a lot more about Latin America than I do, it would seem that certainly in the period from the 30s through the 70s, many of those governments saw business groups as an axis of coordination and for national and developmental goals. Now, the obvious question then is, why did those fail so singularly in Latin America, or even to some extent in Turkey, where they're another big feature, and they haven't failed in Asia? Well, it may be that the clues lie in Latin America as to what might actually happen in Asia, and here it's more conjectural and it's not in the book. Essentially, I think Latin America came to pieces because the distributions of income and wealth, importantly, wealth, very important in all of this, that resulted from this development strategy based on, was so highly unequal and polarizing that in a sense it gave rise to a series of populist governments who essentially weren't, were not immune from basically debasing the currency, pursuing short-run financing and the like. And I think this actually is probably, looking forward, a big danger for Asia. Now, I didn't put up wealth, the enormous accretion of wealth and wealth inequality that's resulted in the last 20, 30 years in Asia. It's in the book. It's absolutely striking. And it's quite interesting that the one very short-lived attempt at what you might call a Latin American style populism, which happened in Thailand until he was ousted, had some of those features. So I think actually that there is more in common, but maybe some of the lessons that come from other places are not necessarily lessons that one would wish on Asia. So the distributional side is very important. A couple of quick responses. We don't actually include Japan in the book. Nor do we include the earlier Asian success stories, Taiwan, Singapore, and the like. We use examples from them, but we consciously chose to exclude them. However, we do use them in terms of some of the policies that were pursued and the like, but they're not at the center of the book. Another point that was raised by a couple of people was the differentiation within Asia, which is huge. And we acknowledge that. And essentially what we argue here is that, as I mentioned in the presentation, you can have these very important connections, linking up these very powerful business groups with politicians across the places, but they may be configured and concentrated in ways that are very different. So for instance, in the Philippines, there are probably about 7 or 8 major business groups that really matter there. There's very high intensity of connections. So most of the connections to power run through very few nodes, as it were. And that results ultimately in underperformance relative. Now, to qualify that, you could say, well, isn't South Korea exactly the same? Well, to some extent it is, but as someone in the audience pointed out, South Korea had the great benefit through policy of having an external orientation. So its business groups were largely or significantly open to external competition and participation in international markets, far more than in Philippines. And then you have other countries, which, as I mentioned already, underperform because, again, they have a very high intensity of concentrations, certain families and the military, so Pakistan being the leading example, and these tend to run with very high levels of concentration. So yes, there is differentiation, and therefore it does really matter how these networks configure themselves and the distributional results that flow out of them. And those are important caveats. And I think Saul's responded to Arvind's point. I agree with you. I mean, I think, in terms of designing policy going forward, you'd have to take it down to the national level. You'd have to look at that. But the point that we were trying to get at is that these common features across these economies and many common outcomes. And these cut across different policy regimes, and we have to ask why.
All right. Is there another round of questions? I have one just to follow up. You pointed out that Japan kind of made it, got over, as did the Asian tigers. To what extent is Korea going to be, an Asian tiger, or will fall into the category that you're worrying about, where they will not, in some sense, make it? And a number of these firms and economies have shown great ability to innovate up to now, which you acknowledge. And then you're worried that it may, however, run out of steam, that they would not, right, continue. So can you say which ones will and which ones will not? Will Korea do it? Will not? Will China, in some sectors, has shown incredible ability to invent, and not only innovate, but even invent, right? What's your feeling there?
So do you want to take it, or should I?
I'll have an initial go. We do think that on innovation, the jury is out, I think, would be our view of this. I mean, I think on South Korea, first of all, they're the country which have been most effective in policy to try, most active, maybe not most effective, in policy to try and roll back the connections world and to try and create space for innovation. However, in practice, they've been very unsuccessful at this, and almost all the innovation in Korea is coming from the top 2 or 3 business groups. And they've spent a lot of money and a lot of time trying to create clusters and Silicon Valley type areas where innovation would go on. And they have, for the most part, failed. But the large business groups do innovate, I think, for reasons Simon tried to say about openness to competition. So the problem for Korea is essentially that all their eggs are literally in 1 or 2 baskets in terms of innovation. If they make a misstep of some sort, literally at the level of they choose to go for electric cars, but the future is hydrogen cars, they're going to be in terrific problems. They are not able to diversify their innovation risks, I think, very well at the moment. Nonetheless, the bottom line of it is they spend a huge amount on R&D, they patent an awful lot, and I would have fairly, and they are trying to roll back the connections world. China is much more complicated and we need ages. I mean, and the data is still coming in. China, what is not clear, there's a very good article, or a couple of articles this week, but in Foreign Affairs by a guy called, I think, Wang, who basically argues that China really isn't very good at innovating or inventing, given the size of it, given the size of the economy, and we have data to argue the same thing, and given how much it spends, it's very inefficient at it. But what it is very good at is applying manufacturing to an extremely high level so that they're able to implement very advanced technologies. And then the question is whether that can substitute for actual pure innovative capability. And I think the jury on China is really out.
Okay, we have one more question and then we'll finish.
Yeah, just a quick one. I was hoping to ask a question with a more historical tilt. Would you say that this model of growth is, if we think about countries in Western Europe, in North America, in Australia, did they experience something similar in their development? I can think of families like the Rockefellers or the Vanderbilts. Is it a similar story and is it just part of development, or is this Asian model, the importance of connections and these business groups pretty unique to Asia?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, this country had business groups, which, as I mentioned, basically only got unraveled by Roosevelt's measures in the 30s and some subsequent. In the UK, it was still possible to have a business group pretty much until the 1960s, and then some changes to the tax code essentially did for them. In France, you could argue that family-based business groups are very important. I mean, the richest, Mr. Arnault and Louis Vuitton and the like, a couple of other families. So they're not entire, business groups have been, for the most part, historically an important feature of the rich world, but they've been legislated away, prescribed, and for good reason. There are some anomalies. Maybe France is a bit of an anomaly, but my guess is that for some of the same sorts of reasons will also ultimately lead Asian policymakers down the same path. And the question is whether they'll have to use the same instruments. And two examples that I've given, basically the US and Japan achieved breaking up business groups by really very extreme measures. Mm-hmm. And it's very unlikely that in the countries we've just discussed today, that there's an appetite for any of that anytime soon. So I'm not sure that that will be achieved as it happens. And just lastly, on the point that Saul rightly made about China, in the book, we're a bit agnostic about China, partly because it's extremely hard to know really what's going on. There's a lot of very loose talk about China being the sort of the be-all and end-all of innovation and invention. And then when you start looking at it a bit closer, it's not really anything of the sort. So China posts enormous amounts of patents, but actually most of them don't get confirmed. And most of them, almost all of them, are domestic patents. So my guess is that a lot of those patents are simply responses to the politicians or the planners' signals, which the companies and the SOEs in particular then absorb. Having said that, some of the big Chinese business groups are among the leading patent seekers abroad. In other words, high quality patents. So something is going on there. And we know that in AI and the like, there's a great deal of progress, whether it be perhaps on the research side, although that's in doubt, but certainly in terms of implementation. But I'll end on one last point, which is how these sorts of things themselves can get skewed by political tastes and directives. A very nice paper by one of Saul's colleagues at LSE looked at AI, in Chinese AI, and indeed documented very significant increments and innovations. Where was the cluster of innovating firms being formed? all around the application of AI for security purposes, primarily for facial recognition and the like. So even there, where you have a new technology being, its actual applications have that. And of course, the final thing, which is only being played out as we speak, and who knows where it will ultimately go, is what role the private firms, private in a qualified sense of the term, will actually have in Xi Jinping's China, and whether indeed that sort of framework will be a good seedbed for innovation. There's, experience from other regimes of that nature suggests that those sorts of arrangements are quite good for large projects, the Soviet Union, as we know, but they're not necessarily good for leading to broad-based invention and innovation.
Saul, anything to add?
Only your question on minority shareholders. The majority of firms quoted on emerging economy stock markets are business groups. And I just think that they, despite all the abuses, they offer very high returns on average.
So diversifying Fidelity or Vanguards or whatever big investors buy some of these big firms in emerging markets and expect that they will get a decent return, even though it's less than.
Yes, I think you can get a return because you spread across them, and the tunneling happens in one year and another year. And if you're diversified enough portfolio, you can get by.
Okay.
By the way, in a lot of these markets, they're not open to foreign investors, so the investor base is largely domestic.
All right. Well, why don't we thank the co-authors? Thank you for the presentation. Very exciting.
Thank you. Thank you.